with Jackie.
And we are live.
Amazing. Hi, everybody.
Hello. I am Jackie Potter with J Potter Health, and I have here with me Jill with End of Life Clarity.
Hi. I'm so happy to be having this conversation with you, Jackie. And I know it's a tough subject to have the conversation about, but I'm happy that we're having the conversation because it's important to have these conversations. And the more that we can talk about it and be real about the conversation, the more that other people will feel better about it. So I'm excited.
I am too. And, both of us are used to having conversations and being excited about having conversations that many people cringe from.
Mm-hmm.
So we both are used to, I can stand up in front of a group of people and say, so has anybody ever felt anxious? And nobody will acknowledge ever feeling anxious. And, just like I'm sure you have some of the same experiences, yet we know that out of 20 people, a good half of them are anxious at that moment.
Yes. I think a lot of people don't understand what they're even feeling. So
Mhm.
sometimes when you say to people, "Oh, are you anxious?" or "Do you have death anxieties?" or, "Have you ever thought about death and dying?" There's like they are so used to just not tuning into what those things feel like that they'll be
Mhm.
like, "No, no, that's not me." I'm like, "Are you sure?" Because it seems like you're having some reaction right now. I mean, I get the straight up like flinching and the like I have to turn around and run away from you when I say to people what I do sometimes. Um, but it's okay. I mean, that's a natural reaction that people have about death and dying, partially because we don't talk about it. And so then we
Mhm.
build up all this anxiety and stress and fear. And so when somebody like me shows up and is like, "Hey, let's talk about death," people are like, "Oh gosh, oh no." Not going there.
Well, for everybody that will be watching this, tell us what a death doula is.
A death doula is something that people have been doing for basically all of human existence, but now there's kind of somebody actually even said to me the other day, it's like trendy now for people to become a death doula, which is kind of interesting. Um, but it's something that we're starting to see more of where people are actually spending time to learn and be able to support people at the end of life. It is completely non-medical though. So a lot of times people will say to me, "Well, isn't that what hospice does?" Yes, that is part of what hospice does. But we, as death doulas, we don't do any medical care. So we're not nurses, we're not doctors, even though some people are nurses and doctors and become death doulas afterwards. It's a different kind of support that we show up for people with. I like to kind of say it's like that holistic, like mind, body, kind of soul connection because we all will experience death at some point, our own or somebody else's that we really love. And because of the way that society has kind of set us up for death and dying, we have a lot of fear, confusion, anxiety, and death doulas can come in and really help people navigate the end of life. We could help people prepare ahead of time as far as paperwork, like how many people out there have wills, have
Mhm.
advanced health directives, which is basically similar to a will, but it's saying like, hey, if I were to get into a car accident and I could not speak because I'm unconscious, what do I want done? We need to have these things in writing. So that's some of what death doulas do, as well as all the way up to sitting vigil with somebody that's dying. We'll actually sit, and not all death doulas do it the same, but that's kind of a lot of what it is that we do just to help people. I mean, that's why I named my business End of Life Clarity, because I really want to help bring some clarity around the end of life for people because we're all really confused. That's how I got into it because I had to navigate it with my grandmother and I was very confused. I had no idea what was going on. And it's not like it is in the movies. And there wasn't anybody to help me. And so now I get to be able to be that help for other people.
Well, and do you work strictly with the person who is dying, or do you offer, because like hospice only works, they come in and they take care of the patient. the person who is physically dying. But we know that death is much more, it's bigger than that. And many people that have anxiety around death, it's not always around their own death, it's around the death of the people they love, what they leave behind. So do you work with people that going the whole family, or just that one who's dying?
I personally do work with the whole family. Not all death doulas do. My mentor, for
Okay.
example, she's like, nope, I show up for the person that's dying. Like, that's who I work with. I really actually enjoy supporting people. Most of the clients actually that I've ended up having have been people that are experiencing the end of life of a loved one. And so they need support processing their emotions, knowing what to do, how to talk to the person, what kind of questions to ask doctors, just kind of supporting through that whole situation. Not every death doula does that, though. I mean, I also work with grief. Not every death doula works with grief. That's the good and the bad about it being something that's fairly new, is all of us can kind of do it our own way, kind of
Mhm.
what works for us, what, fits really for us. But I actually really enjoy supporting just, people that are navigating the end of life that's actually not theirs. But because when we're navigating it for somebody else, it's also just bringing up a lot of stuff. So many of us have really unprocessed emotions, whether it's, again, for example, with me and my grandmother,
Mhm.
where, as I'm getting closer to her death, there's the conversations I wish I would have had that we didn't have. There's things that I want to apologize for that I didn't apologize for. There's like all that stuff that's coming up, as well as, past grief for like people that have died before her that I hadn't processed yet. And the anticipatory grief of like, I knew it was going to happen sometime. She was 93. I mean, it's not like she was young, but there's still part of you that's like, oh, but now it's real. Now this means that my life moving forward is not going to include this person. So much just comes up for us that having somebody to talk to and to, work through some of these things. And, I'm not a therapist. If anything, this is why I say I'm like an end of life coach. I'm closer to a life coach than I am a therapist, where I have activities and I have prompts and I have different questions that I ask, because I'm not telling you what to do and how to feel. I'm just helping people figure it out for themselves, what they need to do as they're navigating it.
Okay. Now, do you work, like, do you have to go to school to call yourself a doula, or any form of education that comes along with that?
You don't have to go to school to do it at this point. If people know of birth doulas,
Mhm.
now birth doulas are regulated. There's organizations that kind of like oversee things. Death doulas aren't quite there yet. We will probably get there. Again, not everybody likes that idea. Some people, and I kind of fall on the line of like, I kind of like doing my own thing and doing it the way I want to do it, but also I understand the need for regulations. So as of right now, you could just kind of say like, hey, I've supported, 5 family members through dying. I want to
Mhm.
call myself a death doula. But, I did go to school for it. There are
Mhm.
online classes that you could take. There's a lot of different doulas that are now mentoring people. So I did an online kind of like college course that was just like the book work. And then I actually signed up with a mentor in California that is super helpful. I mean, her name's Jill as well. And I've like
Mhm.
literally been sitting with somebody and texting Jill and being like, I'm putting like the little swab in their mouth with water, and I'm afraid that I'm gonna like put too much. And she's like, no, you're gonna be fine. Like, that's how it
Right.
works. Like, and I'm like, okay, good. I just wanted that like
Reassurance.
reassurance, correct. Cause, it is,
It's
it,
a big responsibility.
it is. Yeah. It's an interesting space to be in with people where I'm like, they're dying, but I also
Mhm.
don't want to like cause them any suffering by like making them aspirate on water, like, but
Right.
so I recommend definitely getting some type of guidance if people want to become a death doula. And not everybody wants to do it for a career. I've
Mhm.
talked to people that they've done the training because it helps with their job as, palliative care social workers, or actually one of the local hospitals, the guy that like runs the hospital, he told me that he did death doula training because he just wanted to better understand. He was a doctor, moved into administration. So like people are doing this training not necessarily because they want to make it into a business, but
Mhm.
just because they want to better be able to support their already existing clients or their family members as, we all navigate this.
Yeah, I could see this being really good information for someone in the religious field to have as a reverend or counselor who's there at the end of life for them.
Yes, because that is another thing with, again, not all death doulas, but most of us were trained to really show up for people of all religious backgrounds, not me coming in as like, this is me, this is what I believe. It's more like, I'm going to come in and support you no matter what it is you believe spiritually is going to happen to you at the end of life. And that's the way that most of our trainings are done, is that it's really to be there for the person and what
Mhm.
it is they need, not about what I believe. And that's where it is funny, because sometimes people say to me, well, I don't know what you believe happens after we die. I'm like, that's amazing. You shouldn't actually
Right.
easily be able to tell what I believe, because it's not about me. It's not about what I believe. But there are, hospice chaplains, and they
Mhm.
are usually very like non-denominational. They'll show up for anybody. And this could be an extra training that, chaplains can do, or really, like you said, anybody that serves in any type of a function as like supporting people through transitions in their life, births, marriages, divorces, like any of that type of stuff. You can add death into that and really be able to show up for people in a way that it's like, whatever you think is going to happen when we die, amazing. Like, I'm
Mhm.
here to help you kind of navigate the questions and the fears and the anxieties, because in the long run, none of us really know for sure. I have
Right.
ideas, but I don't know for sure. And I don't care who anybody is. You don't know for sure what happens
Right.
after we die. But if you really truly believe that we're going to go to heaven and the heaven's like somewhere up in the clouds, amazing. If you
Mhm.
really truly believe that nothing's going to happen and we go out like a light, amazing. What I believe falls somewhere in between that. But I'm here for everybody. So, like, whatever you want to believe, I am happy to just help you feel the best that you can feel when you're navigating it.
Okay. So I would imagine if you can have a conversation with people about death, there probably aren't very many conversations you back away from.
Correct. I am very comfortable with really uncomfortable conversations. It's partially, I think, just who I am. I think it's also just past work experiences. I've worked with people that have been through a lot of trauma, some in and out of the prison system, homelessness, drug addiction, and I got really good at just showing up for people and seeing them as a human and knowing that we all have our human experiences. And so pretty much, I mean, I've talked to people that they've like, I've shot and killed people. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Like, that must have been really difficult for you too.
Mhm.
So when it comes to death and dying, there are still some things that do trigger me a little bit more. I do struggle a little bit with like the death of children. That's because I have children. That is a harder conversation for me to have. But I practice what I preach, in that I make myself a little bit uncomfortable now and have the conversations now, so that, God forbid, if I ever do have to come up against it, those feelings are still going to be there. But at least now I will have already thought through a little bit of it. And with my podcast, that's actually been a great opportunity, because I've, talked to so many different people now, and I want to hear their experiences. And I have an interview coming up with somebody whose, 13-year-old granddaughter committed suicide. That's
Yeah.
hard. That's really hard. But you know what? If that conversation can help prevent the same thing happening to another family,
Hmm.
and then I feel like it's worth that discomfort. It's worth me feeling a little uncomfortable. And honestly, in the long run, I might learn something too that I should look out for. My kids are 12 and 9. Like
Right.
it's rough. It is rough. I remember being that age and it was hard back then. And
It's gotten a lot harder. I know the CDC just even came out with another report that teen suicide is becoming truly an epidemic in this country.
yes, and we're all afraid to face that. And
Right.
again, I understand it. I do. It doesn't feel good for me to think about it.
No.
But not thinking about it isn't going to make it not happen any more than thinking about it and talking about it is going to make it happen. And
Right.
a lot of the fears and the anxieties that we have about death and dying in some ways is so connected to just that superstition of, well, if I talk about my death, it might make it happen. Or if I talk to my husband about his death, that means I want him to die. Like, no, none of
Right.
that, it's not any of that. And it's not going to work that way. Because really, if it was going to work that way, I won $1 million. I've been saying that now for 3 years since I became a death doula, that if it worked that way, I won $1 million. Have I gotten anywhere near that? Nope. So it doesn't work that way. I promise.
Well, now, how do one of my clients had wanted me to talk about how do you talk to children about death, especially the younger ones who haven't maybe experienced it yet? Because face it, I remember when I was young, my grandparents or great uncles, things like that, you were around death at some point, and you had to go up and look at the casket and go through the process. And we don't have those rituals the way we used to. So I had been exposed to death by the time I think I was 8 or 9 was my first experience with it. And then it just kept going from there. Whereas my kids, who are now in their 20s, have had 2 occasions in the past few years. They were almost adults before it even hit them.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
how do we talk and start making the conversations more comfortable so that when our children are adults, they're not living like we are?
Yeah, that is really a great question. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, partially again because I have children.
Hmm.
And I really have always felt, but even more so, I feel that it's so important for us to have real, honest, age appropriate conversations with children about sex, about drugs, about death, about money, about all the things that we have been taught not to talk about. And right? Like,
Yeah.
so when kids ask questions, our natural reaction is we feel uncomfortable, so we shut the conversation down because we don't know what to say. We are afraid we're going to say something wrong. Maybe we're going to make it worse. And so I've learned myself, partially, again, especially when they're young, ask them a question. Like if my daughter says to me something like, well, what happens after we die? Well, what do you think happens after we die? And maybe she's going to say something totally off the wall. But again, whatever she might say, is it any more off the wall than saying, I'm going to go up into heaven with God and we're going to be in the clouds? Like it is what it is, right? So like
Right.
ask questions back to the children sometimes allows them to kind of vocalize what they really want to say. Because sometimes they'll ask a question when really it's more that it's like, well, somebody at school said their grandpa died and I just don't know what that actually means. Okay, so well, what do you think about it? There is resources, of course, out there. I always recommend, even again, for me, like it's easier for me to talk to my kids about death than it is to talk about sex. So you know what?
Mhm.
I found a class. When it was time to talk to my son about sex and puberty, we took a class together because I was really uncomfortable and I didn't know what to say. Where like death, I mean, my kids, we talk about death all the time, like it's nothing now.
Mhm.
Just part of our everyday conversation. The more that you do it, the more it becomes natural, the more that it gets just a little bit easier for everybody to have the conversation. Now, as people start getting into teenagers, first off, we're exposed to a lot of death on media, whether
Mhm.
it's movies, video games. And I'm not one of those people that thinks like the shooting video games makes people go out and shoot. Like, I'm not saying
Right.
that, but we're exposed to a lot of death and dying that's not reality. It's not what it really looks like. So sometimes when we're watching a movie or like my son's playing a game and I'm kind of like, like that's not real. Like that's not what actually really is going to happen when somebody dies. And then in some cases, he'll just be like, okay, whatever, mom. And then other
Mhm.
times he'll be like, well, what does happen then? And I'm like, well, most of us, we're probably going to get sick and it's a longer progression. It's not going to be like you see in movies. You don't just close your eyes and go to sleep peacefully. Like that's not
Right.
usually what happens. Or even like my son, we were watching a TV show where they were talking about somebody whose mother had died when he was a
Mhm.
teenager and how basically the rest of his life, he just wasted it away. And his older brother in the TV show was like, since mom died, like you've basically become a loser. And so I said to my son, hopefully I'm not going to die anytime soon. But if I do, please don't waste your life stuck in this grief. Like, and we had a conversation about it. And it
Mhm.
wasn't an hour-long thing. It was 5 minutes because something triggered that thought in my mind. And I said, you know what? I should say something to him now because I don't know. I might die tomorrow. It's
Right.
not it's not like, it's not impossible. And I wanted him to know that I really just didn't want him to get stuck. I know you're going to be sad, that's fine, but don't get stuck in the grief. And so when you find those moments that naturally you can have a little bit of a conversation, and maybe the kid will just kind of look at you and do that, like, okay, whatever. But that's
We
also
hear you.
too. It's like you plant those seeds, you start those conversations. And there are some cases when, my child at 9 will say something and I'll say, we don't need to talk about that part right now. Like something was mentioned about suicide and she wanted to know more about it. And I was like,
Mhm.
we don't need to go into depth of like what the person did. It just means that they chose to end their life because they were sick. Like to me, mental illness that caused people to be suicidal, that is a sickness.
Mhm.
Anything else, it's not a weakness on their part. And that is some of what I said to her. But I wasn't also like it. I mean, it was somebody that I was close to. I didn't say to her, well, this is what he did and this is how he did. Like, she doesn't need to know that.
Yeah.
And it's really about that having the age appropriate and getting over our own discomfort and also feeling comfortable saying, I don't know the answer to that. Why don't we look it up together? Like if the kids say something and you're like, oh my gosh, I really don't know what to say. Okay, I don't know. Let's find out together. And then you learn together about it, but not letting our fears and our anxieties cut the conversation short. Because then essentially that's when we teach them that there
Good.
needs to be fear and there needs to be anxiety around death and dying because they're just learning from us. And so showing up, what they called in Buddhism with beginner's mind. They're like, you know what? I don't know what we're going to do. I don't know how we're going to talk about it, but we're going to do it together. And again, there is a lot of resources out there. That is some of what I do as a death doula is help people have conversations. And so
Mhm.
that's one of the things that, I'll say it's like on my bucket list of like what I want to do is actually because of the class that I took with my husband and my son about sex, I want to create something similar for people to have the conversation with their children because we should be having these conversations. We just don't because we don't know how to. And, that's why we're here today.
So, staying with children for just a few more minutes, because I think that that is where a lot of our death anxiety comes from, is from when we're young.
Yeah.
And, I can remember my family wanting to protect me from going to the hospital or going to the funerals and things like that. Like, it's okay, you don't have to go. But then there's this like so much mystery and scariness around it. And alls I know as a child, and I still feel this way, is I'm just never going to see that human being again. And that to me is just crushing. So that's, I think, where a lot of my anxiety comes from. So how do you recommend dealing with, like the physically dealing with death with children? When do you protect them and when do you let them in and see it?
Yeah, it's different for every child first. Everybody is different. Every child is different. It really comes down to, I think, a few things. We get very uncomfortable when we see people being emotional. And so if a child goes into, say, a hospital room and they see, grandmom or grandpop and they're hooked up to things and they get sad, we want to protect them. Well, we think that protecting them means remove them from the situation. We're really just supporting them and allowing them to feel some of those feelings and say, like, well, are you afraid because you don't like the way they look? Like, what is upsetting to you? Can really help kind of make them feel it's okay, first off, to feel feelings, to feel upset, to feel sad, and using language that is not. So I've heard people say to me, when I was a kid, somebody said, oh, they're gone. Well, the child thought that the person just picked up and left, left them. They didn't realize that the person had died. But because we're trying to shelter children from the actual truth of what it is, we actually lead to more confusion and pain and anxiety. And so using the real words, you don't say, oh, I lost grandpop today. No, we didn't lose anything. Grandpop died. Well, what does that actually mean? Well, that means that his body stopped working. And it means that his soul, his being, whatever you want to call it, is, maybe it went to heaven, whatever your family believes. I'm, again, even with my children, I'll say, the soul is gone. It, maybe went somewhere else. Maybe it didn't. I don't know. What do you think? I try to really be that way, even with my children. But just being really honest with the kids and not sheltering them. If somebody says, like, hey, can I go? And again, it depends on the age. A 3-year-old might walk into a room and still just be like, I don't know what's going on. Maybe a 6 or 7-year-old might be upset by the noises and the, the things, some, smells, like anything that's a little bit different. And they might say, what, I don't want to be here. Then being like, okay, I'm glad that, we came, but it's time to go. And not shaming or blaming or almost even like coddling, like, oh, I'm so sorry that I did that to you. Like,
right.
Because then that just makes them feel like, oh, what did I just go through? Rather than just being like, this is making me a little uncomfortable. I think I don't want to be here. Or if they have questions, again, if you don't know, say, do you want me to find maybe a doctor or a nurse that can maybe answer some of the questions about what the different machines are? Because that's how I always was. I wanted to know everything. Well, what's that doing? And why is it beeping? And what's going on? And people would just be like, oh gosh, she's asking a ton of questions, rather than just being like, let me find somebody that can answer the questions. So I was left with a lot of confusion. I didn't understand. It really depends on the kid. And I do feel, though, that the more that we can really honor what they're going through, what their experience is, the less fear and anxiety they'll have. But not pushing it on them either. If they want to, fine. If they also say, you know what, I don't want to go. I don't want to go to the funeral. That's okay too. It's really giving them that ability, even as children, to really have like decision power, like this is what I want. But I do feel it's important to have the conversation in a way that they can get that closure that they need. So there's not that confusion of like, well, what does this actually mean when somebody passes away?
Right. And the whole idea, I actually have a couple of clients that I'm dealing with that are afraid to go to sleep because that's what they were told when they were young. And even though rationally they know that, when they go to start falling asleep and the heart changes, and, because part of anxiety is you're overly aware of what's happening inside your body. So when something starts slowing down or happening, then you become fearful.
Mhm.
And when they have this fear of, well, if I fall asleep, I might not wake up, falling asleep becomes very challenging. And
Yeah.
that does stem from how they were taught about death when they were young.
Yeah. And when we're young, so much of what gets imprinted into us, we then spend most of our adult life trying to undo, which is really frustrating. And something too that I have found interesting when it goes with like religion and death and, what we're taught as children is the way that as we kind of near death, some of that old religious kind of beliefs, for whatever reason. I think in some cases it's almost fear, like I was taught to believe that if I, did this, that, and the other, I would go to heaven. If I did this, that, and the other, I would go to hell. And so even though logically right now, especially, I don't believe it, but if at the end of my life, if, maybe for some reason I go back to Jesus, like maybe it'll happen. I don't know. And again, I have no judgment about any of
Right.
it, myself included. But those imprints that we get as children, just they stick with us. We really can't easily kind of, I wish we could just flip that switch and be like, I don't need that anymore.
Right. Yeah. Well, the hardest part is identifying what it is that you don't need and
Yeah.
labeling it, because, oftentimes what triggers it has nothing to do with what the underlying imprint was.
Yeah. And I think, from stuff that I've learned, as well as just the more that I've thought about it, every fear and anxiety that we really have, when you really dig into it, the root is the fear of death.
Hmm.
I mean, think about anything that you're afraid of, whether it's spiders or heights or other people or whatever it is.
Hmm.
What's the real fear? It's that it's going to
Right.
kill us, that we're going to
Yeah.
die. And if we can really work with that anxiety that we feel around death and dying, I think a lot of those other things would kind of calm themselves a little bit.
Yeah. That's a very good point.
Yeah.
Well, we've been chatting for half an hour.
Yes, we have.
And yes. So tell everybody, and I will make sure to get all the information into all of the comment sections, but let people know, how do they get a hold of you? Where do they find you? You talked about a podcast. So give us your information.
Of course. Yeah. So you can find me on any social media, basically at End of Life Clarity. It's my business name, it's my website. Um, my podcast is called Seeing Death Clearly, and it's been amazing. I've really enjoyed talking to people and being able to share these conversations, just to normalize having the conversations. People
Mhm.
are always welcome to reach out to me on any of the social medias. Yeah, I mean, this has really been awesome, Jackie. And I know you're a anxiety coach. Is that the technical term that you go by?
That's what I go by, because, I really think of myself. I always think of my kids when they were young, and doing lacrosse and basketball, and that the team had a coach,
Mhm.
and the coach spent his time getting the kid out of their own head and then learning new techniques. And
Mhm.
that's what I do, but around anxiety. So
Wonderful.
I say that I build an anxiety toolkit with people so they know what tool to grab for whatever's going on.
Yeah, and that's amazing. So yes, anybody that's on my platform already, if you're listening, definitely. I've known Jackie now. What? It's been a little over a year, right? That we've known
Yeah,
each
it's been a
other.
little while. Yeah.
I think it was like January of last year. So
Hmm.
yeah, I've known Jackie for a while now, and definitely, if you need some help with anxiety, please reach out to Jackie. Same thing, right? J
Thank
Potter
you.
Health is your
Yes.
handle on everything. And again, now if you're watching us on Facebook, I'm sure you could easily connect with either one of us through that. So
Yes. And anybody who's with me that wants to know more about Jill, just get in touch with me and I will connect you. She's amazing. I'm so glad that she agreed to come on and talk about death, because that is a huge thing when it comes to anxiety for many of us that have anxiety. So I really appreciate you giving us some insight on it. Thank you.
well, thank you for inviting me, Jackie. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, I'm going to end us.
All right.
Maybe. There
I
we
know.
go.
I'm like, this is the hard part.
Yes.